At 4:20 in the morning, the valley exploded. American soldiers at a newly built outpost near the village of Wanat woke to the sound of machine guns echoing off the mountains. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into sandbags that had been stacked only hours before. Some of the soldiers had been in the valley for just 3 days. Their base sat at the bottom of a steep bowl of forested mountains in eastern Afghanistan, surrounded by ridgelines that rose hundreds of meters above them. From those heights, unseen fighters were already firing down into the compound. Within minutes, the small American force realized something chilling. This was not a probing attack. Nearly 300 Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions, and one of the most remote outposts in Afghanistan was about to be overrun. How that happened is the story of Wanat. Nuristan sits in the far eastern corner of Afghanistan, pressed against the mountainous border with Pakistan. It is a land of steep ridgelines, narrow valleys, and forests so dense that entire villages can disappear beneath the canopy. For centuries, armies have entered these mountains with confidence and left with something closer to humility. In 2008, this remote province had already earned a reputation among American soldiers as one of the most dangerous regions in the entire war. The Waygal Valley, where the Battle of Wanat would unfold, cuts like a long scar through those mountains. It is narrow, twisting, and dominated on both sides by towering slopes that rise 300 to 500 meters above the valley floor. Every movement on the ground can be seen from the high ground above. Every vehicle on the road can be tracked from miles away. For an insurgent force familiar with the terrain, it was the perfect battlefield. But for NATO commanders in 2007 and 2008, the valley represented something else entirely. It was a corridor. A strategic gateway running from the tribal areas of Pakistan into Afghanistan's interior. Fighters, weapons, and supplies flowed through these mountains with alarming ease. Taliban groups used the forests and villages as staging areas, slipping across the border before coalition forces could respond. And this is where the story begins to tighten. By this point in the war, the United States had shifted toward a counterinsurgency strategy known as COIN. The idea behind COIN was simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in practice. Instead of controlling territory only through large bases and patrols, coalition forces would move closer to the local population. Small combat outposts would be established near villages, allowing soldiers to build relationships with local communities while denying insurgents the freedom to operate. The goal was not just to hunt fighters. It was to control the environment in which those fighters operated. But there was a problem. Implementing that strategy in a place like Nuristan meant putting small groups of soldiers into some of the most hostile terrain in the world. And sometimes into positions that were dangerously exposed. In early July of 2008, American forces began establishing a new position near the village of Wanat. The base would be called Combat Outpost Kalar. Its purpose was to secure the valley, disrupt insurgent movement, and extend government influence into an area that had largely remained outside coalition control. The soldiers assigned to this mission came from Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment of the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. They were paratroopers. Experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to operating in difficult environments. But even among seasoned units, Nuristan had a reputation that made commanders uneasy. Because these mountains did not forgive mistakes. The force at Wanat was small. Roughly 48 American soldiers occupied the new outpost during its first days of construction. Nearby, a smaller observation position known as Post Topside was established on a slope overlooking part of the valley. About 9 soldiers manned that position, responsible for scanning the surrounding terrain and providing early warning if insurgents approached. On paper, the layout seemed logical. The outpost would anchor coalition presence in the village. The observation point would extend surveillance outward into the surrounding hills. But the terrain told a different story. The entire defensive position sat low in the valley. Above it, the mountains formed a ring of natural firing positions that dominated the battlefield. Anyone standing on those ridgelines could look directly down into the American compound. And anyone with a rifle or machine gun could fire into it. But that wasn't the real problem. When the paratroopers arrived at Wanat, the outpost was still under construction. Defensive barriers were incomplete. Sandbags had not yet been fully stacked. Fighting positions were still being dug into the earth. Some heavy weapons had limited overhead protection. And some had none at all. Construction crews worked long hours trying to reinforce the perimeter, hauling supplies, stacking barriers, and building the skeletal structure of what would eventually become a fortified base. But construction in a combat zone takes time. Time that the soldiers at Wanat did not have. Because the enemy had been watching. Taliban fighters in the region were not disorganized bands of guerrillas wandering randomly through the mountains. Many of them had operated in these valleys for years. They knew the terrain, the villages, the footpaths that cut through the forests. They also understood patience. For weeks before the attack, insurgent observers monitored the American presence in the valley. They watched patrol patterns. They studied the layout of the new outpost. They observed the routines of the soldiers working to build their defenses. From the surrounding slopes and village buildings, they could see almost everything. And slowly, quietly, they began preparing something far more dangerous than a typical insurgent ambush. This would not be a small attack designed to harass a patrol. It would be a coordinated assault. Insurgent groups from across the region began assembling fighters and weapons. Rocket-propelled grenades. PKM machine guns. Mortars. Assault rifles. Estimates later suggested that between 200 and 300 fighters gathered for the operation. Their plan was brutally simple. Strike before dawn. Hit the outpost from multiple directions at once. Overwhelm the defenders before American air support could arrive. And this is where the situation at Wanat becomes even more unsettling. Because while the American soldiers were building their defenses in the valley, the enemy was building something else entirely. A battlefield designed specifically to destroy them. The plan to place a combat outpost at Wanat had been made for reasons that seemed logical at the time. Commanders wanted to push coalition presence deeper into the Waygal Valley. For years the area had functioned as a corridor for insurgent movement between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Fighters crossed the border through hidden mountain passes, moved down the valley, and dispersed into surrounding districts before coalition patrols could intercept them. Every intelligence report pointed to the same conclusion. If the valley could be controlled, a major infiltration route would be disrupted. And so the decision was made to establish combat outpost Kalar near the village of Wanat. But almost immediately, the reality on the ground began to reveal a dangerous contradiction. The new outpost was supposed to control the valley. Instead, the valley controlled the outpost. From the moment construction began, American soldiers could feel it. Patrols moving through the area reported being watched from the tree lines. Local villagers were cautious, distant, sometimes openly hostile. Fighters were known to operate in the surrounding forests, yet they rarely appeared directly. They simply observed. But that wasn't the real problem. The deeper issue was the terrain itself. In conventional military thinking, the side that holds the high ground holds the advantage. High ground provides observation, fields of fire, and the ability to dictate movement below. It is one of the oldest principles of warfare, understood by armies since long before gunpowder existed. At Wanat, that principle had been reversed. The Americans occupied the lowest ground in the entire area. The ridgelines surrounding the valley formed natural firing platforms hundreds of meters above the outpost. From those heights, anyone with a rifle could look down directly into the base. Machine guns positioned along the slopes could fire plunging rounds into fighting positions that were still under construction. Even worse, the village itself sat dangerously close to the American perimeter. Buildings, walls, and narrow alleys created dozens of concealed firing positions only a short distance from the outpost. Fighters moving through those structures could approach without immediately revealing themselves. In effect, the Americans had established a base surrounded by potential cover for an attacking force. But the risks were not fully understood yet. In theory, the outpost would become more secure over time. Defensive barriers would be completed. Patrols would expand outward into the valley. Local engagement with villagers might reduce insurgent activity. The plan depended on time. But time was exactly what the enemy refused to allow. By July 2008, Taliban commanders in the region had begun coordinating something unusual. Insurgent groups that normally operated independently were communicating with each other. Fighters were moving quietly through the surrounding mountains. Weapons were being distributed among multiple units. This was not typical guerrilla behavior. Small insurgent attacks were common in Afghanistan. A roadside bomb here, a short ambush there, perhaps a few mortar rounds fired into a distant base. These operations were designed to harass coalition forces while avoiding decisive engagement. What was forming near Wanat was different. The scale alone was alarming. Later intelligence estimates suggested that between 200 and 300 insurgent fighters were involved in planning the attack. Some were local militants familiar with the terrain. Others traveled in from nearby valleys to participate. They gathered weapons that could deliver heavy firepower in a short period of time. RPG launchers capable of destroying defensive positions. PKM machine guns that could sustain long bursts of suppressive fire. Mortars to strike the interior of the outpost. Most importantly, they coordinated their positions carefully. Firing points were established along multiple ridgelines. Fighters moved into buildings within the village. Others positioned themselves along the slopes leading down into the valley. Each group had a role. Some would pin the Americans inside the outpost with heavy fire. Others would close in from the village and attempt to breach the perimeter. A separate element would attack the smaller observation position known as Post Topside, isolating it from the main base. The objective was clear. Destroy the observation post. Then overwhelm the outpost itself. Because if the defenders lost their ability to observe the surrounding terrain, the attackers could move freely down the slopes and into the compound. And this is where the situation becomes even more dangerous. The American soldiers at Wanat were not expecting a battle of this scale. They understood that insurgents operated in the region. Patrols had already experienced occasional contact. But nothing suggested that hundreds of fighters were preparing a coordinated assault against a newly established position. From the perspective of the soldiers on the ground, the valley was tense but quiet. Construction continued. Patrols moved through the village. Observation teams scanned the surrounding ridgelines. But beyond those ridgelines, something far larger was assembling. The insurgents had chosen their moment carefully. They would strike before sunrise. At the hour when soldiers are most exhausted. When darkness still covers the valley. And when the first light of dawn begins to reveal silhouettes against the mountains. Because in a battle like this, surprise is not just an advantage. It is the difference between a firefight and a massacre. The first reports that something unusual was happening around Wanat did not come from satellites or intelligence intercepts. They came from the soldiers themselves. In the days after Charlie Company arrived in the valley, patrols moving through the nearby village began noticing subtle changes in behavior. Some villagers avoided eye contact. Others disappeared entirely when American patrols approached. A few homes that had seemed active days earlier were suddenly empty. At first, these signs were easy to dismiss. Villages in Nuristan had always been cautious around foreign soldiers. Suspicion and distance were normal. But over time, the pattern began to feel different. The quiet was too complete. And this is where the mystery begins. Because the Americans were not blind to the possibility of an attack. Observation Post Topside had been established precisely to watch the surrounding terrain. From that small position on the hillside, soldiers could observe sections of the valley and parts of the nearby ridgelines. 9 men held that position. Their job was simple and critical: see the enemy before the enemy could reach the outpost. But the terrain around Wanat did not cooperate. The forests were thick. The slopes were steep. Small footpaths twisted through the mountains, disappearing into tree cover where even careful observation could miss movement. In this environment, fighters did not need to move quickly. They only needed to move carefully. And slowly, piece by piece, the insurgents assembled the attack. Weapons were carried through the forest at night. Fighters moved along ridgelines that could not easily be seen from the American positions below. Others filtered into the village itself, blending into the same narrow streets that coalition patrols had walked through only days earlier.